So for my project, I did the Mayan or the Guatemalan genocide. Here's some background information. The victims of this genocide were the indigenous Mayan civilians that were living in Guatemala at the time. And the perpetrators were actually the Guatemalan military government that was fighting against guerrilla warfare and accused the Mayans of supporting them. Um, the what, it's exactly what I just explained. Um, the government wanted to eliminate the Mayan civilians because they thought that they were supporting guerrilla warfare, which were considered rebels of the government. So they incorporated counterinsurgency operations that essentially burned villages and buildings and killed and abducted thousands of Mayan civilians. Um, this occurred during the Guatemalan Civil War. This started in 1960 and lasted 36 years. The period with the most killings occurred in 1981 to 1983. Nearly 200,000 people were killed in this period of 36 years. Um, it occurred in Guatemala, which is located in Central America. Guatemala is actually nearly the size of Tennessee, but holds about 2.5 times more than the Tennessee population in Guatemala. This genocide occurred because during the Civil War, it was the government against guerrilla organizations that wanted to overthrow the government. And they accused the indigenous Mayan people of supporting and aiding guerrilla warfare. So essentially, they were wanting to protect their political power and were accusing an ethnical group of this and sought out with the intent to kill, which is what classifies as genocide. Um, they instituted this by starting 3 genocidal campaigns. The first one was Scorched Earth, and the second one was Model Villages, and the third was CPR persecution. These all have very unique and different techniques when they're carried out. For example, Scorched Earth means just destroying everything in their path, burning buildings, killing people, like looking after survivors when they come through these villages. It's essentially, like I said, just destroying everything in their path, hence why it has the name Scorched Earth. Here's some pictures from the aftermath of the genocide and during. Here is the 10 stages of genocide, which we will look into how it relates to this Mayan genocide. The 10 are classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, persecution, extermination, and then the last is denial. So when looking at the Guatemalan genocide, for classification, we see this through the government naming the Mayan civilians as internal enemies. By doing this, they are directly targeting this ethnic group of people as the enemy, and they named them second-class citizens and lower in the ranks of their social life. The second stage, symbolization, this is shown through the government would label villages that were considered more of a threat and not, in the sense that they were helping the guerrilla warfare. So, for example, villages that were considered red had intel that they were supporting guerrilla warfare. So that's how they symbolized them. Third, discrimination. This is shown through them stripping away voting rights and blatantly being racial toward them, discriminating against them. So that's how they discriminated them during this time. Fourth, dehumanization. They dehumanize the Mayan civilians by promoting racist ideas, calling them second class, and naming them inferior to their culture. This largely came from them being conquered by the Spaniards. This is what made the government view them as weak and what made them vulnerable to their abuse. The fifth stage organization, this is primarily shown through the campaigns we spoke about earlier. By organizing these campaigns against the civilians, that's showing that they're coming with a plan to take out these citizens. Polarization. I didn't really see much polarization within the genocide. Some polarization occurred in other countries, which portrayed the Civil War as a war rather than a genocide. But other than that, the government wasn't really trying to convince people of the Mayans being second class or trying to gain support. They instead just already had the power and carried out their plans regardless. They would prepare for this genocide by starving and torturing, raping, and beating these civilians. This was essentially the start before persecution and extermination. They persecuted them through vandalizing these towns, through the campaigns such as Scorched Earth. They would slaughter their livestock and abduct citizens. And for the ninth stage extermination, they instituted Operation Sophia, which was essentially destroying all civilian bases that were suspected of supporting guerrilla warfare, despite innocents, despite families, despite people uninvolved. They would raid these villages and kill anyone in their path. And lastly, denial. When the UN tried Guatemala, the Guatemalan government, they denied all allegations of genocide or any crimes against humanity. So, in order to classify this as a genocide, we must first explore the definition. In order for it to be considered genocide, there must be evidence of intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And these are the 5 ways this can be shown. Number 1, killing members of the group. Number 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. 4, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And 5, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Here I broke down each examples of each way they showed intent to kill this ethnic group. So first we established that the Mayans are an ethnic group that was targeted. And this is shown through the fact that they were exploited and killed by the government's army and police death squad, which were hired by wealthy landowners in order to kill Mayan civilians. So these were examples of intent to kill this group. Number 2, military would come to villages and kill family members in front of each other to see. Women were raped in front of their children, and the children were thrown into pits alive, in which adults were later thrown in. 3, over 83% of people were killed in these attacks, and the 83% were indigenous Mayan civilians. So this shows majority of people killed were targeted as the indigenous Mayan civilians. And 4, they killed and raped women, which shows intent to prevent reproduction. So overall, there's evidence that the government had the intent to destroy in whole or in part by identifying the population of Mayan descent as internal threats. This shows the identification and intent to harm. They instituted systematic killings and massacres against whole villages, the number nearing about 400 or 600 villages. And they were clearly not military targets. Obviously, minors such as children were not conspiring against the government, yet they killed whole villages, women, children, and families. So, prevention and lessons that we should take from this. I did find in my research that the U.S. was heavily involved in promoting counterinsurgent movements, which means they supported the Guatemalan army, which was killing the indigenous Mayan civilians. Their reasoning for this was to contain communism, but had the US not played such a significant part, the abuses of human rights would have been greatly depleted or not as harmful without the training and support from the US government. So I propose that in relation to the US's part, they should have made sure of all the facts of the Civil War before engaging and choosing a side, especially when there's violence being used or that is involved and people's lives are at stake. You can't afford to not know the narrative and be supporting a government, and in this case, ended in genocide, and the U.S. was in support of that. Other countries should have intervened sooner rather than turning a blind eye or just brushing it off as Civil War because it was a genocide. It's actually called the silent genocide because it was the perspective on it was changed within other countries and nobody stepped in until later. And the lesson we should take from this genocide is not everything is as it seems. Nothing is surface level. There's always something more to dig into. And so that's what I take from this genocide and how we could have prevented it. And here are all my citations. Thank you.